it's part of a broader research agenda of mine on trying to understand the impact of machine learning tools on various aspects of the economy and society. And so since our book came out, where the core idea is we should think about, everyone's talking about AI, and as quant marketing scholars, you realize it's not really artificial intelligence. It's good old-fashioned prediction technology. It's computational statistics. It's something actually we've been doing as quant marketers for a while, and it's just now getting traction in some sense in the rest of the world. And what I've been working on lately is thinking about applications of prediction technology to various parts of society. So I have a paper on national security, a lot on healthcare, and a little bit on jobs, trade, classic economics questions. And what this paper is about is in the context of refugee law and refugee claims. And so the genesis of this paper is, I read this book by a colleague of mine. She was at the time doing a postdoc in our law school called Refugee Law's Fact-Finding Crisis, Truth, Risk, and the Wrong Mistake. And the first line of this book says, effectively, what's worse, accepting a refugee claim when the person is not a legitimate refugee, or rejecting a claim where the person is a legitimate refugee? And of course, the framing of the entire book is, well, it's clearly worse to send someone back to wherever they were coming from if they're a legitimate refugee, to have them be tortured or killed or something like that. That framework of thinking through what's the wrong mistake is in many ways exactly how we think about prediction technology in decision theory. And as we summarized it in our book, we didn't put that together in our book, but we summarized ways to think about prediction and judgment as, okay, well, we have a likelihood in this context that somebody is a legitimate refugee or not. Let's say they're 10% likely to be a legitimate refugee. Is that the right threshold for saying, 10% is good enough because making the wrong mistake is such a big deal, or not? And so I reached out to Hilary, and together we wrote this paper. And so the basic idea of the paper starts with something that we know about in marketing, because we spend a lot of time with the consumer behavior folks, which is that human adjudicators are often unjustifiably certain in their beliefs. And so, the core background research there is Kahneman, Tversky, and the behavioral econ and behavioral decision theory literature. Refugee law is a really important example, like a high stakes example of this, because there is little data, right? So how do you know if you're a refugee, if you're a judge, if you're an adjudicator, how do you know if, how do you learn to make the right kind of decision? So someone stands in front of you and you believe them or you don't believe them. And then you decide whether to send them back to a different country or to allow them to stay. The examples here are going to be in Canadian refugee law, but European and American is very similar in terms of a lot of the details. And so you decide whether they're going to stay, but there's no feedback loop. If you allow the person to stay in the country, then you never learn if they were a legitimate refugee or not, because you don't know if what would have happened to the counterfactual. If you do instead send them back to their home country or to wherever they were coming from, you don't know. It's very, very rare that you would ever get an update on what happened to them. And if you did, it might happen 5, 10, 15 years later. So this is a domain where there's very little data and claims are inherently uncertain. So where does machine learning come in? So one version of this is machine learning is totally useless here, because it tells us, when you think about the first moment, the mean, there's so much variance around it that it's useless, right? We don't really know, because there's not a good feedback loop in most cases about whether a particular person is telling the truth, particular facts are true, etc. But used properly, we shouldn't just be getting a point estimate, we should be getting a range. And machine learning tools, or statistical decision-making more generally, have the ability to make uncertainty visible. And by making uncertainty visible, we can reduce the confidence of the human adjudicators in refugee claims. So just as a caveat here, we are not saying the machine should replace the human as the adjudicator. That would be a bit too much of a stretch for that literature. In that instead, we're saying the machine can serve as an expert witness effectively, just like human expert witnesses would, and provide some context for the degree of uncertainty. And this would potentially, again, with caveats that I'll get to, reduce overconfidence and lead to better decisions. Okay. So is this marketing literature in the drawing on the ideas in the paper, or building the ideas in the paper, a lot of these ideas came from my own work and others in marketing and econ. Embracing uncertainty has a long way to go, or could go a long way, sorry, to reduce bias and improve outcomes. So that's the essence of the paper. Now, when we look at who's talking about AI in marketing and how it affects the future of marketing, there's the first half of almost every paragraph in every paper that says, this is going to be fantastic, right? We can use prediction tools to change marketing strategies, to layer them onto maybe causal inference and improve our advertising, improve our pricing, understand customer behaviors, better serve the customer. It's just going to be great. And then every one of these review papers has a but. And the but is, but there's all these policy questions related to privacy and bias and ethics. And we look at all the keywords, and first we start with the exciting new keywords, artificial intelligence, marketing strategy, robots, and then we get to privacy, bias, and ethics. And most of these papers view those those privacy, bias, and ethics as reasons not to do it. Okay. Maybe we shouldn't build an AI because the AI's machine learning tools are going to violate privacy, and especially in the context of this refugee paper, maybe we shouldn't because they're going to be biased. And in fact, when I approached Hilary, my co-author on this paper, legal scholar, say how maybe we should think about AI in refugee law, she's like, no, bias, bias, bias. There's no way it's irrelevant. And almost every one of our conversations for the first month of this paper had the word, that phrase, bias, 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 appeared over and over and over again. Okay. So I'm going to try to plant seeds on how to think about this in the context of marketing. Then we're going to go to the refugee paper, and then we'll come back to the marketing framing at the end. And my selfish hope is that one of you is going to identify a great way to apply some of these ideas in a marketing context, and either do it on your own or reach out to me and we can work together. Okay. So the first question is, when should distributional information lead to better decisions? So when do we need more than the point estimate? We thought about probabilistic goods, where we know the distribution. Insurance and financial services marketing is a little bit on that. Consumer budgeting and basket cost, I think there's a big part there. And I say distributional information, but I actually think in the context of refugee law, we don't even know the distribution. And so this is much more Mansky style understanding, like Knightian uncertainty. We really have no idea how to fill in the missing information. Okay, so we don't even know the distribution, but we can still make better decisions based on our understanding that we don't know the distribution. There's another question on, can consumers and managers, even if we did this and provided this information, can people interpret that data? They even know, if we tell people, you just don't know, there's crazy uncertainty, do they then just ignore the machine, or are there ways to make the machine understood and lead to better decision making? And then there's a third question, which again, I don't think we, at least from my reading of the literature, I've spent some time in this, I don't think we know how humans make decisions with asymmetric penalties in the right, like in the context of predictions and prediction. So happy to be told that there's a great literature and I should read it. Okay. So as I said, the first line of this book is, which mistake is worse, to deny a claim that should have been granted, or to grant a claim that should have been denied? And in the presence of a wrong mistake, reduced overconfidence should then increase the fraction of accepted claims. So this is so if we take the UN Convention of Refugees, to be clear, that UN Convention of Refugees says there is a wrong mistake. It is really bad to send someone to deny a refugee claim, kind of like the flip side of reasonable doubt, okay? If you have reasonable doubt, then you should accept the claim. Now, lawyers are not statisticians. And so reasonable doubt, or in this context as well, there isn't a right percentage. We don't say, reasonable doubt means 5% or 10% or 15%. And in fact, to my surprise, in having these conversations with some legal scholars, they don't even accept the idea that there could be a right percentage. Reasonable doubt is reasonable doubt, and that is in the eyes of the humans, and it could be 5, 10, 15, depending on the context. Okay. My economics brain does not, really struggles with that, but that's how they think of it. Okay. So note the law as currently practiced in Canada, most of the world actually doesn't recognize the wrong mistake. So almost every country has a workaround, because almost every country wants a system where they don't want to accept every refugee. And so the workaround in Canada, for example, is there's first a balance of probabilities on whether you're telling the truth. And then it's a reasonable doubt story, conditional on telling the truth, whether you're a legitimate refugee. But since it's balance of probabilities on whether you're telling the truth, then effectively it's a way to make it balance of probabilities. So point one is using AI to reduce confidence would only work to reduce bias in the system, or at least to move toward shouldn't say reduce bias in the system, to move toward accepting more refugees if it's accompanied by changes to the law. Okay, so the law is currently practiced where it's effectively a balance of probabilities. Accepting a wider range isn't going to make any difference. You say we don't know anything, then it's not really going to make a difference in terms of accepting more refugees. In contrast, and this is a common theme when you think about using machine learning tools to help organizations and change, and really improve processes, is it's not just dropping in a machine prediction where there used to be a human prediction, it's actually changing the system. And here the way the system would need to change is to move toward something like reasonable doubt. And just to give you a sense of how bad claimants can be, there are some adjudicators who've accepted almost every claim. So claims are randomly, cases are randomly assigned. There's some adjudicators that have accepted almost every one, and others that have rejected almost every one. Even the same person, there's cases where they effectively hear the same information and make different decisions. So Hilary talks about one case where two members of the same family in front of the same adjudicator got different outcomes. Same evidence. Okay. So, right, so the idea that
on that point, it seems like then a big part of the problem is what we might, at least if we don't condition on the adjudicator, think of as variance.
Yes, absolutely. So, well, there's the variance here is in two dimensions, right? So there's, and this maybe gets it there. So there's variance on their predictions, right? So this person is 5% refugee, this person is 75% likely to be refugee. And there's variance on judgment, which is, or payoffs. If somebody is accepting a refugee, or accepting someone who's a refugee who's not legitimately a refugee, is 10 times worse than, or sorry, is 10 times better than rejecting a refugee who really is a refugee? Or is it 20 times better? Or is it 2 times better? And in most human decision-making, especially in legal systems, we don't really separate the prediction from the payoff. And if you're using a machine, right, the machine only gives you the prediction. So you actually have to separate the prediction from the payoff. And so one of the hardest things to do in all sorts of aspects of using machine learning tools, and this includes marketing, is to figure out what the payoffs are. Because once you have the prediction, you can't just go with your gut and pretend that it's some combination of your prediction and your payoff.
Though I guess just one further comment there is it's unclear if that is a psychologically accurate or behaviorally accurate model of these adjudicators. Do they form a prediction and then integrate their loss function over the prediction?
Almost
no.
surely.
Right. And
surely.
so, yeah.
Almost surely they look at somebody and decide whether they believe them or not. And then, at least from my understanding of this literature, what they do, there's variance again across people, but a lot of them seem to make very quick judgment about whether this person is trustworthy. And then the rest of the facts support they look for facts that support their initial impression, as we've seen in lots of other contexts in terms of how people make decisions. So
Avi, just to follow up on Dean's question, right? So as I think about what you're saying, right, and I think you write this in the book as well, right? The idea that there is a cost of type 1 error and type 2 error, which is what you're emphasizing a lot. And then what is the type 1 error and type 2 error? And what the AI is going to tell us is a little bit more about what's the type 1 and type 2 error likely to be for this particular case. And you standardize on that so that it is a little bit more obvious what's the cost that different adjudicators place on the type 1 and type 2 error, and we can probably have the law minimize it. Would that be a good way to think about it?
Yes. So I'm trying to think if so yes, in the world where yes, up to a point. So that's essentially the starting point of there's these type 1 and type 2 errors, and there's uncertainty, and we should make the better uncertain. Where this is going to go eventually is we don't even know. I guess it's similar, but we don't even know that it's 85% or 75%.
Right. So there is contamination from your beliefs, etc., in terms of what you think is going to be the uncertainty. But there is also the issue of how do I differentially think about the cost of sending a person back? And if that person dies, like I might feel very bad and somebody else might not feel that bad. And those are two factors, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there may never be, to the extent that they never get real feedback, they might anticipate, a fully rational person might anticipate they would never know. And maybe that makes them okay. So they don't have to worry about that, feeling really bad in the future. But maybe there's all sorts of, that's great. There's all sorts of questions about how these people make their decisions that are, at least I don't understand. And I think they're generally not well understood.
Yeah.
Just this new literature. It's an emerging literature around the world on judges in these sorts of cases making, the judge fixed effect really matters a lot.
Right. And so that is why what you were saying was interesting about the same person meeting the same family.
Yeah.
And there you are likely to think that it is more the uncertainty of how they interpreted the particular individual and less about the belief system. And maybe there is an identification opportunity of some kind if you see large enough cases of twin persons or families being rejected versus etc. Okay? You might be able to get some fixed effects of behavior as opposed to uncertainty.
Absolutely. And these are, the data is available. It's not public, but it's you can get it from a access to information request.
Avi, I can see that consistency will be much better, of course, using artificial intelligence in any decision, but here it will be even more important. But in terms of bias, like depending on who writes the algorithm and what kind of algorithm, can the algorithm itself be biased? Like we already know from the literature that they don't have a good record in terms of, race and gender, these algorithms. Yeah. And I can think the same way, maybe it will be an algorithm that will be biased against Syrians because they come from a Muslim country, let's say, than Burmese ones who are thought, I'm just making this up, they are Buddhist and more peaceful or whatever. Actually, this particular topic is very dear to my heart because I sit on the board of TENT, which is a not-for-profit organization to encourage businesses to empower refugees worldwide. It was founded by the Chobani CEO, Hamdi Ulukaya. So we discussed some of these issues about refugees. So my question back is, have to make sure that the algorithm itself doesn't have these built-in biases.
Absolutely. Okay. So first, yes, and the as one interpretation of Absent-Lanathan's work is first, the algorithms are only going to be as biased or unbiased as the desires of the humans making them. Point number two is on balance. This is Sendel and Jan Spice and a bunch of others, as Yad Obermeyer. On balance, the people making the algorithms are, at least because they have to think carefully before they do them, those algorithms typically are less biased on average than human decision making. But, and there's a very important but, which is I think where you're going, where they are biased, they matter at scale. And so any remaining biases are a really big deal. So absolutely. Okay, so point number one is, designed to reduce bias, fine. Point number two is that at scale issue, it's a hard problem. I'm not going to solve it today. I'm just going to say that. Okay, I agree. Point number three is where this would be applied within the law is actually not on, is this person legitimate or not? That prediction, because the way the legal system, or at least the legal system works in in countries where the legal system is derived from British law, you need a human to make that, like it's a human, the human jury or judge is responsible for guilt or innocence, or truth or not. But experts have an important role. The role of experts is to weigh in on facts. And so where this could be practical is to have machines weighing in on facts. Facts like, what's the likelihood that the police in, I think of a particular case we looked at, in Italy discriminate against homosexuals to the point where that person would be a legitimate refugee? And you can get a probability. What are the, and in contrast, you could think about a different country. And then in terms of refugee law, you'd have to layer that in. The person comes from one part of Italy and they're claiming refugee status. And actually in this particular case, if I remember the details, the conclusion from the adjudicator, which was, there's no machine learning involved here, was they should just move to a different part of Italy. And so that claim was denied because it wasn't Italy as a whole. The person had the right to live in Italy. So, sorry, I got distracted. Right, so point number one, less biased than human. Point number two, skipping a point. Point number two, it's a big issue at scale. And this other point that you would have to design it carefully. And part of that design would be to think through what kinds of things are are places where the bias is less likely to play. Like what are the predictions that actually statistical decision making or we're calling it an AI could really do. Great. I'm curious to hear all about that, Tulin, at some other time when we're back in person. Okay. I don't know if I'm going to go through this just very quickly in terms of the decision theoretic framework on thinking about machine learning that comes in many ways from marketing science and from Sendel's prediction and policy problems paper. Let's say you want to go for a walk and you got to assess your decision is whether you take an umbrella. And the classic decision theory version of this is if you take an umbrella, you get some payoff if you're dry and a different payoff if you're wet. And carrying an umbrella is something you don't like to do. And so we can draw out the decision tree on thinking through the probability of rain versus shine. That's what your prediction machine would give you, 25% rain. That's your weather forecast. And then you make the decision about whether to take the umbrella. And so the key thing here is from a decision theoretic framework, decisions require both a prediction and an assessment of the payoffs. In current legal systems, those tend to be mixed, but this decision theoretic framework is, it's not like the lawyers don't know it, or legal scholars at least don't know or understand it. It's in the background, but the prediction and the payoff tend to get mixed together. So I think many of these points have been answered and as I've answered your questions, but we've seen decision support in lots of applications. AI providing decision support. Not, to be clear, this is not about automation. Right? These are still ultimately human decision. And even in a lot of marketing applications, as long as we think of it as a recommendation engine, as opposed to perfect prediction, the Google "I'm feeling lucky," no one uses that button, even though it still exists. These are decision support engines. And so we get this mean and this distribution, and with sparse data, the mean and the distribution map. Oh, perfect. Okay. So there's a lot of anxiety in the refugee context, and Tulin just highlighted some of it. In legal proceedings or whatever, that there's lack of transparency, accountability, and potential for bias. Okay. And if we argue that this is an important aspect of it, theoretically ideal circumstances, okay, which is that if the law were changed in such a way to be consistent with the UN Convention on Refugees. So shouldn't be that ideal. Everyone signed the UN Convention on Refugees, but there are very few countries, or at least the ones that my co-author is an expert on, Canada, US, Europe, parts of Europe, we don't have these theoretically ideal circumstances where there's a recognition in the law of the wrong mistake. There's always a workaround. Okay. Nevertheless, with proper statistical decision making, we could make better decisions. Okay. And here's where we differ from the existing literature. So, so the Kleinberg paper that I talked about already argues that algorithms create opportunities to detect discrimination, increasing the transparency, right? Here, this is something different. This is the recognition of the uncertainty. It's a very simple point. The recognition of uncertainty leads to particular outcomes when the stakes are asymmetric. That's it. And so wherever there's asymmetric stakes, and I think part of what I'm interested in thinking through is marketing applications with asymmetric stakes. Whenever there's asymmetric stakes, just embracing the uncertainty matters. Okay. So, okay, here we go. Just a little more legal background. The Refugee Convention put in place a very low standard of proof. Qualifies refugee, a claimant must have a well-founded fear of persecution. Okay. In Canada, we call this more than a mere possibility, which you can think of as something like the flip of reasonable doubt. It's really about the lowest standard of proof of anything in law. And would suggest the people who drafted the UN Convention wanted people to resolve doubts in the claimant's favor. But in practice, that's not how it works. So, so, and I just describe the Canadian workaround, as proud as Canadians like to be of our immigration and refugee policy, it's just like everyone else's in various ways. And the two-step process is you have to prove each one of your facts is more likely than not to be true. Okay, that gives the adjudicator a lot of opportunity to reject before they have to think about more than a mere possibility. And it's the refugee that bears the onus of proof in that first stage. So, okay, sorry, I think I've talked about that already. Okay, so an example. A claimant is convinced, has convinced a decision maker the adjudicator, that her ex-husband wants to kill her and will be able to find her if she returns. The only remaining question is whether the police will protect her. On the law as it stands, the claimant must prove that the police will not protect her. So if evidence on this is scarce, then the claimant can't show the police will not protect her. And how do you show that the police will not protect her? Or maybe the police haven't protected her in the past, haven't protected others like her. It's a difficult ask if the proof is on the refugee. Because the claimant bears the legal onus, the only doubts that matter are doubts about the assertion the claimant is trying to prove the police will not protect her. And so any doubts about the contrary, the police will protect her, are legally irrelevant. And so that means that if the evidence is scarce, the adjudicator is going to, might conclude the claimant has met her burden of proof, might not. Now, if the refugee status decisions were made using, until this language is the humanities language, not the economics language, okay, were made using an abductive model of reasoning that solves doubt in the claimant's favor, as the convention would suggest, then uncertainty about the counter theory would always be relevant. So whatever the merits of the claimant's case, the more uncertainty, the greater the claimant's chances of winning. So no matter what, if the system were restructured as it's supposed to be, then no matter what, you increase uncertainty, you increase the likelihood that a claim is accepted. Okay. Now, how's
Avi, just a clarification on the previous slide.
Yeah.
I don't know how deliberate the words whether the police will protect her should be taken literally, right? Like in any place, even if the police will protect her, there is a chance that the police will fail, right? Is that, and that can happen even in the best of countries. And that can happen, of course, in much more likely in the worst of countries. So I'm just trying to interpret what the meaning of the word "will protect" is in these kinds of settings. Yeah. Because you could say that in the US, right?
So my understanding of this is it's a statement about whether it's something the police in that country take seriously. Okay, so because it's a statement about whether the legal system in the country you're coming from will take care of you in a way consistent with the convention. So will is not definitively will. I think will means some effort will be made.
Okay.
That's a great point. And my understanding, it's not necessarily a comparison saying as much effort will be made there as would be made in Canada.
Would be a good benchmark, yeah.
Would be a good benchmark, but I don't think that's how it works. Okay. So how is statistical decision making going to work here? The role is to make the doubt explicit. Okay. And I saw there was a question in the chat. Well, maybe the central challenge here is to ensure a massive, unbiased, centralized data set. And what the main challenge, so that would be if you were solving the Kleinberg et al. Problem on building unbiased algorithms, that's the central problem. Here, the central problem is something different, which is to embrace the fact that we don't know anything, okay? Or that we often don't know anything. So the bias is in the background, and I think of that as being solved by a different strand of literature. Here, the problem is something that we just don't have a lot of data. And so rather than thinking about distributions and variance the way we usually about it, I think we need to lean on Mansky here and talk about identification for prediction and decision making and just recognize bounds. Okay, so the predictions are likely to be imprecise. An indication of uncertainty can skew decision making toward a cautionary approach. So the AI would explicitly note there's a great deal of uncertainty as to whether the police will respond to an appeal. Human judges often overweight that. Formal specification of uncertainty it's not necessarily that we know the distribution. It's just that we know the range of possible outcomes. And if the range of possible outcomes contains, goes high enough, essentially, that it's more than a mere possibility that this person is a legitimate refugee, then that claim should be accepted. So it isn't, the framing we set up through decision theory is through classical decision theory before Mansky, is, oh, you know what? More than a mere possibility, let's call it 5%. And so if we have a prediction machine that tells us if this person is likely to be a refugee or not. And if it's more than 5%, then we accept the claim. Mansky, a Mansky style framework is different. This says, we don't really have a lot of information. We know it's not 0. Let's say we know it's bigger than 2. And for this particular set of facts, we know it's less than 90. Okay. Well, 2 to 90, that's more than a mere possibility. That claim should be accepted. Even though 2 to 90 contains, 2 to 5, which is less than more than mere possibility. That's the story here. So doing this, of course, requires a change in legal structure, a change in a user interface. So there's a whole bunch of questions around how do you design a user interface so that even if you had human judges, could they even appreciate this level of uncertainty? Or if you told human judges they're uncertain, would they just start ignoring the machine? Data gathering issues, data bias, and of course, implicit in this whole paper is the point that we want to increase the number of refugees, right? Or at least ex post, the results of this is going to be much more, many more refugees accepted into the country. That may not be a politically palatable outcome, even though it's what the UN convention says should happen. So back to marketing. We've sort of thought about these ideas and written them up in the context of a particular very high stakes decision, okay? At least at the individual level. Should this person be accepted into the country or not as a refugee? I think there's lots of situations where embracing the uncertainty around the machine predictions will help us make better decisions. Some of those we already understand. That's sort of the probabilistic goods literature frames that. In some case, a generalized auction does that, thinking about embrace the uncertainty about whether someone's going to click on the top link, the second link, the third link. And of course, insurance and financial services are largely about selling distributions of outcomes. But I do think when we layer on asymmetric penalties, and asymmetric payoffs, my sense of the marketing literature is we don't have a good framework for thinking about that. And actually, maybe I should put it differently in terms of what the contribution here is I think the contribution is to say, those ideas that appear, that Mansky started working on in the early 90s, that he applied to healthcare about 3 or 4 years ago, he applied to public policy about 8 years ago, I think are more useful across the board than we realize, and they're going to be more useful as we use statistical prediction for more and more decisions. So just this recognition that sometimes our predictions, it's not that they're uncertain in a classic sense, they give us a distribution, it's that they're uncertain in a Knightian sense. We just have no idea. And Mansky provides a whole set of tools, starting with this book and then in others, in terms of others, it's in healthcare and in policy, in practical contexts, how to do this. And this, trying to get my head around how to do this in the refugee context, made me, at least maybe hope is the best way to put it, that we can figure out how to do this in management and marketing as well.
Sorry, Avi, can I quickly clarify how we should think about the characteristics of the applicants here? Because if I look at the proposal is to change the system, how it's evaluated, and it's a big function of uncertainty. If I'm a person who is not a refugee who wants to get into a country, knowing that, I'll just make my application very uncertain, and this will. It's not clear to me how to deal with that, right?
Yeah. So okay. So now how do we think about this in equilibrium? Is the
right.
question? Yeah. It's a great question. I sort of tried to fudge it with these last two lines here. But so here's how I think about. So one of the places we've gotten pushback on this paper is, well, then you're just going to accept every refugee, okay? And so then we started reading through the cases and trying to identify cases where it's pretty clear that with enough data, at least, this is clearly, this is not going to be a legitimate claim, okay? And there are, let's call them two categories of that kind of case. Okay. Category number one are people who you can find through other data systems that that seem to be let's call it likely candidates for economic immigration, but not for refugee. So someone from there's a case of someone from the United States. Actually, this case explains both types. So an American applying for refugee status in Canada has, a well-known record, social security number. Canadian immigration can get all sorts of data on their employment history and their interactions with the law, et cetera. They don't look like a legitimate refugee in that dimension. Okay, so that would be, we know a lot about this person. And so it's hard to find. Now so the equilibrium response might be to change your name and try to lie, but maybe there's enough data for that kind of person. So category number one are people we know a lot about. But to your point, someone from Afghanistan or Syria almost surely is not going to have a really clear record of their employment history, and they're going to look like a legitimate refugee. Might be a legitimate refugee anyway, but they're going to, on reasonable doubt, they're going to look that way. And then the second dimension where this would be distinguishing, even if we're thinking about the Mansky style, is because remember, ultimately it's an expert, not the judge on whether you are or aren't. So there's many cases where it's clear that these are things that don't happen. Right? The extreme version is that particular American I described wanted to be a refugee because something about the FBI putting using radio waves to allow aliens to attack him or something along that. It was in that area. He needed to leave the U.S. because the U.S. government had a conspiracy against him having to do with aliens. Okay, we'd be comfortable saying that that's not true, I imagine. And so, but there's a whole category of people who are claiming on certain grounds that are clearly untrue. Okay, and it's distinguishing that way. So those are the ways that would be distinguishing. That said, there's a third challenge, according to my co-author, which is that lots of refugees lie. Okay, and even what's weird about it is, even though they're legitimate refugees and they don't need to lie, they're scared and they don't really know the system. And they hear from a friend of a friend of a friend that someone's claim was accepted under this story. And so they repeat that story. And then often claims are rejected because they're then caught lying. Even though they're legitimate. And so that adds a whole nother layer of complication to thinking through the equilibrium because in some sense the equilibrium of trying to do whatever works is already happening, and it fails. And I would worry, maybe this is a caveat why this shouldn't happen. I would worry how this is going to play out is people are going to learn to try to communicate uncertainty. They're going to try to communicate uncertainty. We're going to be able to statistically show that what they're saying is untrue. And then even though whatever their real claim might have been was widely uncertain and perhaps likely to be true. That's a great, maybe that was a long way of me saying, I agree equilibrium is an issue. It's something to think about. And okay, here's what it was. Equilibrium is an issue. It's not solved, but it's not even solved in the current system. And there's whenever you tweak these things, there's going to be all sorts of responses like that are going to lead to a couple of years of chaos before we figure it out.
I think maybe like on the last point about like line and how it doesn't need to be line. You just can be selective about facts. You can be, everything can be correct. You just selectively report what you put in the application. But otherwise, I understand.
Right, absolutely. Well, yes, and you can selectively report.
To increase uncertainty.
Machine, you might be differently selective. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So Mos and Ryan, Kristen and I have been working a little bit on this formalization, but we haven't gotten as far. What am I doing for time? I wasn't sure if I'd get to this. Maybe this is actually, let me just say we've been working on formalizing this, this idea of an asymmetry and trying to think through how we can get human decision makers in the context of a marketing decision to listen to or not listen to the machine. And we've developed all sorts of Bayesian, all sorts of math around it, but we haven't quite nailed it. And where we haven't quite nailed it is that, so we nailed it like, hey, this formalizes what we talked about in the paper. I'm not, in 12 minutes, I'm not going to go through the formalization, so we have Q&A time. But actually getting, for example, subjects to getting marketing payoffs so asymmetric in like a mechanical Turk type setting hasn't played out yet. And so we have to think through what we haven't gotten to is a point where in a marketing context, the asymmetries are big enough that the ideas from the refugee context apply. Okay. So just to wrap up, thanks for questions so far. I was told to leave 10 minutes for more Q&A, but we think about AI as prediction technology, and so my recent agenda has been to try to think through how does this apply in all sorts of aspects of society. This paper is about refugee law, and trying to unpack it in refugee law, we realize the importance of not just embracing uncertainty generally, but not the uncertainty where you don't even know the distribution. For that, I will stop sharing and open for questions.
I had a quick question, Avi. So on the previous slide where you kind of showed us some model or some framework that you're thinking about, how do you think about the machine learning or the decision maker learning? Because I think you mentioned in the beginning that there's very little data, there's very little feedback that the decision maker gets. So I'm just curious, at least in that framework or in the framework that you're thinking about, like how learning happens if there's very little feedback.
Learning in a machine, like learning as in
okay. Right.
So
or the decision maker in your framework there.
So I think we so let's say we have I don't know, 10,000 claims a year. I have no idea what the number's, probably, let's say 100,000 claims a year. Okay, it's easier. For something like 50,000 of them, we're going to have very little information about the facts of the case, very little details. We're not going to be able to look back and see what happened. For some small fraction of them, there may be good data. We may even be able to decide that, I can think of a variety of ways to decide that, you know what, those cases, the facts were clear and the outcome is clear. Okay, so the example, one example being people who we have lots of data about because they're applying from countries where we have lots of data about them. Another example being facts that we have lots of data about. We know from data the fraction of, so another case was, I think it was a homosexual from Germany claiming to be, there's a lot of the European in the Canadian data on that. And that was just not accepted, okay? And because we have lots of data on the legal system in Germany and how that plays out. So ultimately what this tool could do, I think this is to your point, is it could learn in places where there's lots of good data about, and then embrace the fact for most of the world and for most refugees and for most facts, we don't have good data about them. And so it ended up being a very selective expert, which in some sense is how we use experts in legal proceedings already. You know, if you're an expert witness in a case, you don't know everything. You're there to comment on a particular thing that you know a lot about. And you can think about the AI doing the same thing. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it helps. Thanks.
So I think that would kind of lead to some of the issues that Julian was bringing about, right? In the place where you don't know the data, you put a country fixed effect or of some kind, and you essentially get to some of the issues that was coming up. Right, and that's a challenge, I guess, right? Like, in some sense, but there's nothing better than you can do. So this is, I think, your point.
Well, so I think that, but in the places where you don't have data, the takeaway from this framework is, yes, it will be biased in some sense because you'll be accepting almost every claim. And so it's biased, but it's biased in a way against the wrong mistake.
But you could also bias it the other way, right? If suppose you believe that claims from Syria may have may be different on other outcomes because there are other dangers or whatever, and you could bias it the other way around. But I get your point, yeah.
So it's there's the biased literature has emphasized the framing you have, which is we got to get the right data. We have to make sure it's sort of.
So one minor question, I think in your abstract, I saw this, and then I think in passing you mentioned this. I was curious as to understand what, did you really, was the claim about abductive reasoning that critical, or mostly it was inductive reasoning with uncertainty would perfectly be fine? Or was there anything special about the term abductive reasoning that we should think about?
The legal system, okay, so in my head, no, there's nothing special. But in my co-author's head, yes, there's absolutely something important.
You could almost see the gap in the reading of the article, when I was quickly seeing, and I just wanted to clarify to myself if there was something there, yeah.
I think in the way the legal system frames these issues, the type of reasoning matters a lot in terms of getting you to reasonable doubt, because it matters in sort of who's responsible for proving what.
Right, thank you.
Avi, can I ask about the type of outcomes we learn from when the result of data? Because if we want to understand is it legit claim that this refugee needs to move away from the country? Do I get it right that the only cases we see what happened is when it's falsely rejected, refugee stays in the country and something bad happens? We never know the other case, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we don't consider any negative bad actions of the person who was not refugee who moved to the country. That's not the question here. The question is entirely about how to judge is a reasonable threat to this person in the country.
So, yes, but I think the core takeaway from that statement is there'll be this framework for decision making will be more useful on predicting the likelihood that facts of the case are true, as opposed to the likelihood that this particular person is a legitimate refugee. And so, just because if you think about there's a paper on bail decisions that has a similar sort of issue in counterfactuals, which is that you don't know what would have happened to the people who stay had they left. So in this context, if it's going to be used, it's much more likely to be useful for things like there are these facts of the case that are typically a combination of country and worry. that you would be able to use statistical tools to assess, right? So is this the kind of thing that that country's legal system protects against? Is this the kind of claim that does this kind of thing actually happen in that country? And then there's, I should say, in the adjudication, there's also a third category, which is there's lots of awful things that happen to people that are not, that do not make them a UN Convention refugee. And so there's also a, yes, that's awful. We feel horrible for that person, but they're not a legitimate refugee under the convention.
Got it. And then related to this, another way to think about uncertainty here is we have some identification of these cases because, for example, of judge fixed effect. Imagine there is a judge who affects no one versus everyone. You can trace what happened to all the people who were rejected and compare pure prediction without this kind of more formal identification part to what you'll infer if you use judge fixed effects, for example, to identify if you reject what happens to this person and which percent of cases actually this is realized.
Sorry, I don't quite. I think I don't quite understand the question.
So there is two ways to think about uncertainty here. One is from pure prediction from the data and comparing what happened in the country otherwise to these people. But you can still argue there is something unobserved about people who apply. And even if we know a lot of characteristics about them, we cannot kind of cleanly predict what would happen if they're rejected. Another way we can predict it is to use the current data where judges make all these calls and judges make mistakes. And so this is similar to papers where if there is eviction case going on, you're randomly assigned to a judge who will always evict versus never evict. We can trace what will happen down the road to the family outcomes.
Yeah.
So in some way, by adding a machine learning tool, we restrict data from which we can carefully learn what actually will happen. We need to rely more and more on predictions versus that on.
No, that
makes sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that gets to Raluca's question a little bit too. So one version of this is we can think about the assignment to judges as random, just like they do in that huge literature on what happens to people based on whether they end up in a tough sentence or an easy sentence, or this patent examiner or that patent examiner, whatever that might be, and do it in this context. So the challenge here is we would need to invest a lot more in figuring out what happens to people. So maybe, just maybe, even though we don't observe the counterfactual of those claimants whose claims are accepted and who stay in the country, the problem here is we don't even know what happens to people who are sent home or sent back to a different country. I shouldn't say home. And so without investing, so at least in the legal proceeding stuff or in the patent cases where we think about randomization on judges, we know what happens to half the sample, or at least some, right? We know in the bail proceedings and the people who were let out, we know what happens. We know if they end up back in the system. And here we don't even know that. And so there needs to be a massive investment in tracking what happens to people. And I think there's two major barriers to that. First is it's expensive, and I'm not sure that anyone has any desire to do it. Fine, but maybe, but it might just be increasingly feasible with digital data tools. The other is, maybe I just combine the two. And one is just the technical aspect of it, and the other is, does anybody really want to know? And the answer might be no. And so making that happen is tricky.
I see. So incentives part. But then it's just, you're saying like this is just not possible as even to use this data properly. Got it.
So it's 1 o'clock. So I think the allotted time for the talk has expired. So thanks so much for the interesting talk and for the discussion, everyone. feel free to stick around and continue the conversation if you'd like. But I just wanted to like delineate the end of the formal talk.
Thanks, Avi. I have to go. I have a meeting, but this is very interesting. But we'll talk about the refugee application.
Absolutely, like to talk more.
Bye.
Thank you, Avi. Yeah, that was great. Really enjoyed the talk. Yes, thank you.
Thanks for the talk. I'd love to reach out and talk to you more about this
Okay, we'll do. Someday we'll be in person.
someday.
In November, I'm allowed across the border. So
So really, there's no feedback like that because these people get a status, right, as a refugee. I don't know, they have this is a status, I guess, and that has to be updated at some point, or there's really no
real
information. They transfer to a different status, or
you have feedback on, I guess, in this, once somebody is claimed in the system, you have feedback on whether they broke other laws. And
and they